Hi, everybody, and welcome to this wonderful panel this afternoon. Is this real life or is this just fantasy? I want to take a moment and acknowledge that we are on the unceded ancestral and traditional territories of many different Indigenous and First Nations. I don't know where everyone on this panel is located, so I'm just going to put that out more broadly and just remember that we extend gratitude to all the nations and Indigenous peoples living on the lands currently known as British Columbia, and any other locations where people are viewing from. So thank you for that. I should just introduce myself quickly. I'm Rob Bittner. I'm moderating this panel. I'm not that interesting, but I do a lot of work with YA literature and stuff. So, but let's dive in. So I'm going to get everyone to do a quick introduction of themselves. And maybe then after that, we'll move on to some questions of genre and stuff. So hopefully that's good with everybody. So I'm gonna go from this way to this way on my screen. So we'll start with Rebecca.
Hi, I'm Rebecca Sky. I wrote the Love Curse series that started off on Wattpad, and I'm in the up-and-coming, my dog is pushing in here, on the up-and-coming body positivity anthology called Everybody Shines that comes out with Bloomsbury in the spring, and I'm super excited about that, and thanks for having me.
Fabulous, thank you. And next on my screen is Tash.
Well, first of all, I would like to see the dog.
Oh.
Just be like this.
Say hi, buddy.
Not as cute as the dog. I'm Tash Mcadam. I write queer adventure stories, mostly science fiction, but I'm moving into contemporary now, and I have written some fantasy, although it never found a home. It just molders on my computer, sadly.
Yet.
Yes.
We'll get there.
It was my second book. We're letting it molder. I might rewrite like the entire thing from a different perspective. Universe good, story bad.
Okay. Next up, we have Sabina.
Hi everyone, I'm Sabina Khan, and this is my book, The Love and Lies of Roxana Ali. It came out last January, and my next book, Zara Hussein is here, is coming out in April of next year, and I'm super excited to be here and for this panel, and thanks for joining us.
Fabulous. Next up is Nafiza.
Hi, my name is Nafiza Azad, in case you didn't know. I wrote The Candle and the Flame, which came out last year. And my next book is The Wild Ones, a broken anthem, a girl anthem for a broken nation. An anthem for a girl nation. It's been a long day. It's coming out next year. I don't know when, but it'll be out, I hope. Yeah, I'm happy to be here.
Well, thank you for joining us. Next is Jennifer.
Sorry, I have to keep muting it so that you don't hear the people in the back of my house. I'm Jen Sommersby. I write YA, I guess. I mean, there's fantasy with historical elements. It's kind of a pile on. The first book is called Slight, came out in 2018. The sequel is called Scheme in the US, and it came out in April, and it's called The Undoing in Canada. I also wrote a contemporary, which was an adventure for me, called Fish Out of Water. It's a spin on the Little Mermaid tale in conjunction with the Young Actors Project, which is a wildly popular YouTube channel, so look them up. I also write romantic comedies for adults under another name. And I teach creative writing to tween and teen writers, and I see a couple of my kids in the participant. I love you guys. Hi. Yeah, so a couple of my kids are here, so I'm gonna say hi. Not my personal kids, but like my students, my super writers who are all gonna get super famous, and I'm gonna take all the credit.
Awesome. Next up, we have Rachel.
Hi, I am Rachel Lynn Solomon, and my next book, it'll be my third, comes out in 10 days from Simon & Schuster, and it is Today, Tonight, Tomorrow, and it is a romantic comedy that takes place all in 24 hours on the last day of senior year.
Woohoo.
And thank you for having me.
Thank you. That sounds fantastic. Next up is Tracy.
Hi, everyone. My name is Tracy Deonn. I have a book coming out in September. It's my debut YA fantasy novel called Legendborn, and here's the cover of the art. It's super gorgeous. I love looking at it. And it's contemporary fantasy about a girl who's grieving and then discovers that there's a secret world of magic at the campus where she's studying, and that they may have connection to her mother's mysterious death. And I also write nonfiction for teens and adults. And I have a Star Wars story coming out in November with the 40th anniversary Star Wars anthology, From a Certain Point of View.
Okay, that's just awesome. Last but certainly not least, we have Sarah.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for having me. My name is Sarah Raughley. I'm the author of the Effigy series. Here's the first book, Fate of Flames, which I like to pitch as Sailor Moon meets Pacific Rim. And I am also publishing a historical fantasy next year in the fall. And it's kind of stars an African tightrope dancer with magical powers in Victorian England. So it's called The Bones of Ruin, and look out for that. Thanks for having me.
Fantastic. Well, welcome all, and thank you for those great introductions. So this panel is sort of more like it's more like just a chat, a fireside chat. So one thing I just want to start with maybe that will get the discussion started is, I know certainly when I'm teaching literature, there's often, you know, this weird thing where we try to categorize everything very distinctly. Here's your realistic fiction, here's your fantasy fiction, here's your, you know, sci-fi, here's, and we try to sort of put everything in their little boxes. And one thing that we were talking about a little bit just before we went live is, where are all those spaces in between? What is fantasy even? What is realism? Where does it cross over? So I might get each of you to maybe just talk a little bit, however you want, about, you know, where your writing lands, how you understand your writing in terms of fantasy or realism, and maybe get the conversation started that way. So I don't know if somebody wants to start off.
Well, I can start.
There we go.
I actually caught only the tail end of the conversation that you guys had before we started, but I was always very curious about the difference between urban fantasy and contemporary fantasy. Just because when I pitched The Fate of Flames and when we went out on submission to editors, I always thought of it in my head as a contemporary fantasy as opposed to an urban fantasy. But I remember that one of the worries that we had was that it would kind of be lumped in with urban fantasy, because at the time, you know, the publishing industry had decided that we've had too much of Twilight-like books, and thus urban fantasy was over. So I was a little worried that in the YA landscape, so I was worried that my book Fate of Flames would be kind of put into that bracket, and then what is the difference between those brackets? For me, I always felt as if urban fantasy was a little more in terms of, you know, a little grittier, a little, you know, city driven, and also had to do with the critters, you know, the vampires and werewolves and that kind of thing, which is why I saw the effigies as something entirely different, because even though it's fantasy, it's set into the contemporary world, and it doesn't really have to do with sort of the grittiness of urban fantasy or the, you know, the creatures, the supernatural creatures that we usually associate with urban fantasy. But I'm interested in hearing other people's thoughts on that and any other thoughts on the topic.
Who wants to go next?
I can kind of talk to it. I always thought urban fantasy was, I write contemporary fantasy too. I always pictured urban fantasy was when the world was aware that there's a magical element, like everybody just knows that vampires are a thing and werewolves are a thing or whatever. But with contemporary, it's like the regular world with a magical element thrown in, and maybe that's a secret thing or only a couple people have that. So that's kind of how I have always interpreted it, but I don't know. Tracy, what's your thoughts? I know you also write.
Yeah, I've just been sort of like parsing through my thoughts about it. So, you know, I can only speak to my perspective. I think publishing as an industry has its own ideas and will always sort of like name certain things, you know, in certain categories for convenience sake. And I know when I go on Goodreads, I'm all over the place when I look at the sub, you know, genres. So readers even, you know, do this. But for me, I think of the types of fantasy in sort of two very broad umbrellas. There's like a high fantasy or an epic fantasy, in which case we're in a completely different world. That's like Lord of the Rings. And then I consider, contemporary fantasy the other sort of a big umbrella. And within that, I think urban fantasy is a subgenre. I think there's sort of a rural fantasy that has tropes that are like urban, but they're not quite. So when I think about like the Susie Stackhouse, Sophie Stackhouse novels with Charlotte Harris, I think of that as like, that's rural, but it has urban fantasy tropes. So urban fantasy to me is very much about the setting and about sort of the magic and the paranormal world that happens in a city that's very dense with a lot of people and hidden nooks and crannies and, clubs and bars and, shops that no one can see if you have to walk by at a certain angle. And so I feel like urban fantasy has this whole sort of texture of world that feels very different than contemporary. I think of contemporary as just sort of like in the modern day. So like Sarah, you were talking about Twilight. In my head, I was like, oh, Twilight's contemporary fantasy because it's like set in Forks, but there's a small little city town, but it's clearly like sort of in the woods still. And so that's kind of where I split off. But I'd be curious to hear what other people think or what other publishers have even called your books.
There's this book called Constructing Adolescence in Fantastic Realism by Alison Waller, and she, for her, contemporary fantasy is fantastic realism, and she defines it in very different ways, like fantasy that occurs within, as Tracy said, within the contemporary times, within the modern times. And it's an interesting book, and I recommend it if you want to further your understanding of how adolescents react to fantasy and how we might, write successful books. So for me, contemporary, I feel like we get caught up in these tags, and then when we're writing stories, because I wrote a high fantasy, and it's definitely when you're writing, these categories do matter, because publishers like to categorize stuff neatly, and because I guess that depends on how they promote it, right? But when I'm writing, I don't care. I just want to tell the story. My upcoming book, The Wild Ones, is, I don't know how to define that, so I guess I'll just call it contemporary fantasy. I guess everything falls into it. When you don't have a definition, just call it contemporary fantasy and it will work. So yeah.
I'm curious, so I strictly write contemporary, but I'm really curious where paranormal falls into that. Because I feel like everyone kind of associates paranormal with Twilight. Is paranormal a subset of urban fantasy, or is there just so much overlap?
I would say yes. I mean, I think it depends also on what book it is, because paranormal can also mean paranormal in historical paranormal fantasy. Because paranormal to me is supernatural, right? So you can write a historical novel featuring paranormal creatures. So.
Yeah,
I think it also
supernatural versus magic, it's not really the same thing. Some books have both, but if it's supernatural, it's like ghosts, ghoulies, werewolves, and vampires for me, whereas magic, it's more like wand waving or magic coming out of you, or elemental magic or something like that. Like Tamora Pierce's Elemental Magic series is like not at all paranormal to me.
I think it also changes with the times colloquially. Because I remember, again, after Twilight, and there was this big boom of books like Twilight that were being sold as, oh, this is like Twilight except with this supernatural creature, and this. Those books were called paranormal. Even though paranormal could be, stuck, that take could be stuck on multiple different books with supernatural elements, we had come to see it, more of a narrow kind of definition of paranormal as being like in the tradition of Twilight. And now I don't think, it's been sort of 10 years, it's been over a decade. And I think that, the labels have changed a little bit.
Yeah, no, there's so much interesting sort of overlap between various sort of concepts of fantasy, realism, contemporary, high fantasy versus urban and contemporary, and that sort of thing. One of the other things, I mean, this panel is about fantasy and realism, and some of our authors here are not writing within the fantasy or even within those sort of subcategories of fantasy, but more in the realistic fiction sort of category. But even that, you know, you're still writing fiction. So I'm curious, when it comes to contemporary realism or realistic fiction, and then we can move into fantasy, how do you decide what to include, like how much to mirror society as it exists, or to think about changing certain elements of reality within your contemporary realistic fiction? Is that something you consider?
I'll actually like to say something on that. I think writing about, like for me personally, writing about a culture that's very different from what readers are used to, you're already doing, I don't know if this is the right word, but I mean, you are doing sort of some world building here, because you're, you know, we have different rules of behavior, different rules of speaking. I mean, you know, even if it's in English, like a person whose first language isn't English, even if they're fluent in English, they still speak grammatically slightly differently, you know, because you tend to if you're not born, you know, if you're not speaking English from a very young age, and you know, you've learned it as an adult, you do tend to translate a little bit, and so the shifts a bit, and that might sound strange to people who are not used to it. The way they behave, their reactions to, you know, the people in their lives, you often, I find myself almost having to explain that in the book, in the contemporary book I wrote, as much as I did when I wrote the fantasy, because the fantasy was based on a Hindu goddess, a girl, the character was a reincarnation of a Hindu goddess, and to have to explain that, I had to explain, I felt like I almost had to explain as much. And so I think that's where, I don't know if that's really answering your question, but I was just thinking about how, you know, that, like, for me, it's real. It's a very, like, the lives and the experiences of the people in Roxana's story are very much real to me. But, you know, I know that they're not for other people who are not part of that culture. And so you find yourself explaining a lot, or, you know, having to really think and decide how much you want to explain and how much you just want the reader to sort of, you know, absorb from it, or it's been a long day. I can't find the word, infer from it, you know. Yeah. So yeah, that's all I wanted to say.
I can follow that, because I think you're spot on so many things, Sabina. Like, I think, you know, some of what you're asking, I feel like is a little bit about audience and how we have to think about our audience. And I think, you know, if I'm thinking about publishing, and it's a choice, right? Like, I can write wherever I want, however I want, publish however I want. But if I wanted to publish traditionally, in sort of a commercial setting, then I do know that what my audience is probably going to look like, what the divides are going to be in terms of experiences and perspectives. And so I did find that for my novel, I was world building Blackness, like, just as much as I was world building fantasy. I mean, I wrote this in such a way that I want Black girls to feel like they are just there and that they understand and they can start right away. But the reality is that I chose to publish a traditional industry set in the United States, which means a lot of my audience members are not going to be Black girls. And so I was like, well, some of my work here as a writer, because I want to speak to my audiences, is building Blackness in. And for some people, the people who live that life, that's going to be affirming. But for other people, that's going to be educational. And part of the world building is going to be moving in that space. And for me, because it was contemporary fantasy set in today, I really built in an environmental antagonistic force, which is racism. So, like, as much as we have all of these different layers of antagonism that we build in for craft reasons, for Black people in the real world, we do have an environmental antagonistic force, which is racism. And so that became part of the story, in addition to fighting demons and all of the other things. I had a character who was fighting against all these layers of forces working against her.
I found a similar thing because I write fat and disabled characters because I'm fat and disabled, but I found that when I'm writing contemporary, I have to do more of that world building because there is a system of rules that work against marginalized characters. But when I'm writing my fantasy novels, I can put in any systems I want. So I actually have I feel like my characters are almost more free because they're not dealing with fat phobia or ableism in the same way, you know? So it's interesting to play with what access your characters have, whether it's a contemporary world or a fantasy world, and how does that change? And how true do you want to be to the world as it is now? Like, if I don't show what it's like for a disabled person who doesn't have the access, am I really giving an accurate reflection of the contemporary world? So those are questions you always have to ask. And like Tracy was saying, you know, representing, you know, giving the Black viewpoint to a white reader, like you have to do that world building, because no matter how much I read, I will never fully understand, you know? So yeah, it's an interesting balance, and there's benefits to both, to having the freedom to do whatever you want or having to fit into the contemporary world.
And I think also what I'm sort of thinking now is this discussion of realism versus fantasy, people's experiences, and I'm especially sort of zeroing in on what Tracy said about building Blackness. It sort of reminds me of conversations around authenticity that have often been really kind of contentious in my own publishing sort of journey, because as we know, Blackness is many different things. You know, I'm Nigerian Canadian, so obviously there are experiences that I share with African American people, but there are things that I don't share at all. And even among Nigerian Canadians, there are things that I share, there are things that I don't share, right? We're not a monolith. I have my own experiences being born in Canada, you know, and various things that when I was sort of writing one of my earliest books that never got published, so don't look for it. It's in the trunk somewhere. But what I wrote was a Nigerian character, a Nigerian Canadian character at first. That made sense to me. I was building Blackness in a way that made sense to my sort of experiences. The problem is that those experiences weren't the correct experiences that is sort of considered Blackness in the American publishing industry, right? The American publishing industry is its own beast. It has its own set of understanding of what Blackness should look like, of even what Afrocentric fantasy should look like. And so because those rules are so set, you know, there are many white editors and white authors who kind of, you know, well, not authors, white editors that looked at my work and said, oh, this isn't what we consider to be an authentic, realistic Black character or African character. We expect this. Especially for me growing up as a Nigerian, I guess, in the diaspora, to sort of see certain parts of my culture being categorized as fantasy when there are parts of that culture that are very real to me, and thus maybe is a little bit more difficult and there's more emotional labor in accessing it. It just makes things a lot more messy when you realize that, you know, you want to write your own fantasy novel according to your own experiences, and you also have to adhere to what the American publishing industry sees as fantasy and realism. Mm-hmm. So I don't know if like that made sense or if that was just word salad.
No,
like it's very complicated, I guess. Mm-hmm.
Does anybody else want to chime in off of that?
With queer and trans rep within fantasy, I often see that only trans characters being paranormal in some way. There's aliens in sci-fi, or like ghosts, non-binary mermaids and things. And authors will write those characters in and not realize that they haven't got any human people who identify as queer and trans. So they're like trying to be inclusive, but ending up othering like my identity is only in that book as a monster, basically, like even if they're like a good monster or a good alien. And so I get pretty frustrated with that, and I kind of have a thing now where if an author has written the only trans character that they have included, or like gender non-conforming, if they're the only character is not a human being, then I won't read it anymore. Like, you have to have somebody else in your book who also isn't a monster, otherwise I'm done.
That is very fair.
I just wanted to sort of piggyback off what Tracy said earlier, just about how you built racism in as an antagonist. It was something that with regard to my own experience, I'm Jewish and I write Jewish characters. And in my first two books, if my first one, especially, the main characters are conservative Jews, and conservative is not a political term in this sense, it's a branch of Judaism. And they are quite observant, and it really was built into the book, but they don't ever encounter anti-Semitism. This is just the way their life is. And yes, there is some explaining that I need to do for the reader, but I really wanted to portray Judaism in this positive light, just have people in a contemporary novel being Jewish and not having anything bad happen to them because of that. And my second book went similarly, but then with my third book, it's been an interesting experience because it's my first romantic comedy, and yet it's also my first book where the characters confront anti-Semitism on the page. So what you said just really like struck a chord with me in terms of like, it almost makes me wonder whether I was world building like this more idealized version of what I want an American Jewish character to experience versus the reality.
Mm-hmm.
I have something to add to that, because what Rachel said was exactly what I did with The Candle and the Flame. I have Muslim characters who don't ever speak about being Muslim because it's accepted that they're Muslim, and there are other religions in the book. And religion, I did not even put a conversation about religion in there, because it was accepted that everyone would have their own beliefs, or even if they did not believe, it was their own right. And I guess it was my reaction to everything that was going on at that point. I wrote the book in November 2016. But, I mean, if you remember, so I feel like I built it was idealistic of me too, because I had been seeing so much conversation, so much rhetoric on the internet and social media, that I was tired, and I just wanted a space in which we could just exist without having to discuss certain things that everyone else was discussing. Utopian, but I mean, if you can offer an escape, why not, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's so interesting, because I think I had, and obviously both of these are valid, but I think I took the opposite route in that this third book, Today, Tonight, Tomorrow, is the first book I wrote completely post-election. I drafted it in 2017 because I wanted something, first of all, I wanted something like fun and escapist, but then I was like adding that real element of like, this is what people like us are dealing with right now.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, this very much speaks to the question that I was trying to articulate, but not so great at the very beginning, in terms of, what you choose to include versus what you don't. What are you mirroring from reality versus what are you trying to change within the text? Not having your Muslim characters talk about religion, or not having your queer or trans characters experience homophobia or transphobia within a text. Do they always have to come up with that? One of the things I always, come across when I'm reviewing is, do you really, I'm always thinking about, do you have to include all those transphobic and homophobic slurs in the text for us to realize that people experience homophobia and transphobia? So you're all speaking very much to that question. I very much appreciate your perspectives. This is really fascinating. Tash, you look like you want to say something.
Just gonna make a joke. How else can you know that being part of the struggle of being marginalized is a struggle if it's not on paper constantly, and the only version of yourself you get to see is about how hard it is? I think there's power in both. There's power in deciding that the world that you write is going to be better than the world that we live in, and choosing to omit things that we know exist just so that you can have like a positive, enjoyable narrative, or even if it's like fraught with other difficulties, but have it be separate from the difficulties in our modern world. But especially with contemporary things, that's a balance beam to walk on. You have to be thoughtful and careful about what you are and aren't including.
Do you feel like, because this is something I wrestled with in my book, do you feel like we almost have an obligation when we're including those, you know, the struggle type stuff? Do we have an obligation to show like our character confronting it and succeeding? Or because like, I guess like what is the responsibility when you're writing for children and young adults? Because in my book in particular, my editor really pushed me to have sort of like I hesitate to say like a reckoning, but she wanted this like anti-Semitic character to kind of be called out at the end and just be really clear that like my main character had the last word and she knew what the other person was doing and why it was bad. So I would be curious to hear other people's takes on that notion of responsibility.
I think for me personally, it was very important in Roxana's story and and Zara's that they do confront those kind of issues. And it's not necessarily like them, you know, winning, but more about trying and pushing back. Because some things you can't win in the, you know, confines of one story, but it's important to show them pushing back, standing up, and knowing that they have every right to push back, and just not to think that, oh well, this is how the world is and I just have to deal with it. So for example, in the Zara, she deals with a lot of racism and Islamophobia, and she's just had enough. And it was very satisfying for me to write a 17-year-old girl who's just decided that she's just done taking, you know, this kind of behavior and taking this kind of constant, you know, this battling that she has to do. And she's done, and she has people around her also equally fed up and just pushing back. And just to show, and because this is what I see in reality as well. Like I have young children and I you know, they're friends, and I see them, they're standing up, they're protesting against things, even if it's not affecting them, they're protesting in support of other people that are, you know, going through that. And I think it's important. I mean, you know, it would be, I don't know, like I feel like I would not be doing the character justice if I didn't show them standing up for what they believe in and for what I believe is wrong. You know, so it's kind of like, you know, I'd be a hypocrite. I'd feel like a hypocrite if I was writing about this character going, you know, experiencing Islamophobia and other forms of racism every day of her life in, you know, in the form of either microaggressions or a bigger sort of thing, and then just not doing anything about it, right? Like I don't know if I wanted to create that kind of a character or that I should, you know, because I feel like, I mean, it's a privilege that we get to write for young people. And it's a privilege to be able to share these kind of experiences, but also to show that they can have a positive, that these young people can make a positive impact and can make a difference, because in real life they are, you know. So yeah, that's how I feel about it.
Yeah, Sarah, you were starting to say something.
Well, I was going to say, first of all, that resistance is resistance. Joy is also resistance. I don't always want to see myself in books having to confront racists. I don't always want to see myself depicted, you know, as a Black woman depicted in books, you know, where I'm in prison, where I'm fighting against, you know, I'm being beaten up by cops. I think that's partly, maybe that is partly why I write fantasy, because, you know, when it comes to fantasy, you can create worlds that deal specifically with that in fantastical ways, and that can be an allegory for, you know, the kind of lives that we live in real life. And you can also create escapism, and sometimes people need escapism, especially nowadays. There's enough to be depressed about. I think that every once in a while, for a marginalized person to be able to go into a book and not see themselves, you know, the target of police brutality, slavery, this and that, is itself, you know, as a writer, you're also creating an act of resistance through your work just by writing that. But I also think, to go back to what Rachel was saying, and I think she mentioned that her editor sort of wanted her to write an anti-Semitic character and this and that. I hope I'm getting that right. I'm not. So.
Oh, sorry. It was more she wanted that person to get some comeuppance at the end.
Comeuppance, okay.
Yeah.
Well, I always think that at the end of the day, it should always be up to the author, especially if the author is marginalized. Something that kind of worries me a little bit, or that concerns me, is when editors and agents who are not marginalized in that way are pushing the author who is marginalized in that way to depict a certain experience. So I always have to ask that editor, or at least, I don't know, maybe you have to drum up the courage to ask that editor and that agent, from which perspective are you coming from? Why is it that you want me to write about my Black experience in this certain way? Is it because you, perhaps as a white person, have grown up seeing those depictions of Black people, and that's what's real to you? And that's what you think will sell, perhaps? That books about police brutality and this and that, The Hate You Give, that kind of thing, that's sort of what will sell, and you're just trying to make the sale. I mean, you have to ask questions, because it may not always be coming from the noblest of places. And I always think that there are power relations within that relationship that can get a little bit messy when somebody who's not marginalized in that way is telling you how to write your experience. So.
That's very true. And I do just want to mention, because I love my editor, that I felt in this particular case that it was the right decision. Like, I'm happy with how it turned out, but I have a friend who's a queer author, got some notes recently from an editor who isn't, and just it was really upset by how things were interpreted. So that's such a good point about an editor who is not part of that marginalized group guiding you a certain way.
Yeah, Tash.
I had an offer from an agent, and when we had the conversation, she wanted to talk about, there's a scene where this trans kid gets arrested, and she really wanted it to be like conflict of being trans and arrested and how dangerous and terrible that is. But it's like, the story is about a murder, like that's not the main thrust of the narrative. The arrest is very short, it's not even really on screen, and I immediately was like, nope. Good day. If you would like more pain on this book just because it's like reality, then no, this is not the book for you. But it was really interesting I hadn't even thought of that, because that wasn't the story that I was telling. And so to have it be like, oh no, we're going to need to see how terrible it is in order to like make it feel real to this person, a cis person who has presumably never been arrested as a trans person in their life. Like, it made me really uncomfortable, and I had to like sit back and think about why. And I was like, oh, it's because you have no right to tell me what kind of trauma my characters should experience related to their marginalization. It's like, that's not the story I want to tell, and you don't get to tell me that that's my story.
Yeah, it's so interesting, like how often I hear from people writing contemporary realism and stuff, that there's so much focus, especially among marginalized authors, around pain, as like that is the story about pain. It's trans pain, it's queer pain, it's the inability to experience joy in life through your everyday life. And so I have seen a lot of conversation about expressing Black joy, queer joy, joy in a fat body or a disabled body, or like all of these spaces in which you can still experience joy. And I guess my question is, how do you work to sort of, walk that balance so that, characters can experience that joy, and you can still explain that, challenges are out there, but it's not all about pain and trauma.
I just wrote a body positivity rom-com featuring a fat main character and disabled love interest. And for me, it was really important that every time there was a microaggression or aggression on page, that there was a greater moment of joy and that they had safe spaces. So like my fat main character has a group of friends and they quilt feminist quilts, and they're all fat and they're all disabled and or trans, and they are safe for each other. And that's a place where like my character gets refilled and is able to have those positive moments, and the love interest in my main character, they're safe places for each other. So I think it's important that the aggressions and microaggressions to marginalized bodies, that you also show their moments of joy. And for me, it was more important to give more time to the joy on the page than it was to give to the pain. So that's what I chose to do. But from my own experience, I can't go out for a day without having a microaggression happen to me for being a fat woman. And my disability is invisible, so mostly people just go for that. But so I know, so when I was writing, it just naturally came into my story because it's just naturally a part of my life. But obviously my dream for life is just to live in those moments of joy, not to have that oppression or those moments. So that's where I try to keep my focus. The main focus of my story is to be the moments of joy and the moments where my character is triumphant and in his or her own power. So their own power. So yeah, so that's where, for me, that's how I tried to address that. But like, I don't think there's anything wrong with having a whole book that's just about joy, you know, and you know, maybe it isn't an accurate reflection, but sometimes people just need the mental break from what they deal with, you know. So
my upcoming title, The Wild Ones, which is actually a broken anthem for a girl nation, is I finally got the title right. It follows a group of girls who are all sexual assault survivors. Now, it was very, because it's an own voice story, it was difficult to write because I had to confront a lot of pain that I had squirreled away inside myself. But at the same time, I wanted these girls to show their anger and their anguish, but I wanted them to be happy as well. I wanted to show that they were more than victims created by society and the people who were supposed to care for them. So I feel like, as Rebecca said, getting those small moments and really making those moments shine can really balance the pain that they have to battle, because the story is so concerned with coming to realizations of their own selves and actually verbalizing their own pain. Just having just showing the pleasure they take in the conversations with each other, in the sisterhood they have created. I felt, and giving them the agency to rescue someone else from what they weren't rescued from. I felt like that was my way of balancing it out so that whoever is reading would gain some measure of peace.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
It's interesting. I was just sitting here thinking about how the joy appears in my book. And I think it shows up in lots of places, but I realized sort of halfway through my revision process that what I was hoping to have the reader experience is this sort of the constant drain and the sort of low grade tension of living in a world where you are facing microaggressions at any moment. And I think that there's a tightening of pressure and tension on my main character when she's in these spaces. She's a 16-year-old Black girl in the South, in North Carolina, and she's infiltrating a secret society. So it's just mostly, cis white hetero background, although there's lots of queer kids in my group. But she's in this space that was not built for her, right? And it wasn't built for any person of any marginalization, really. And that's something that I reiterate, that sometimes you're in a position where you're going to a certain job or a certain campus, you're walking in a place as a marginalized person, and you will probably be there as a marginalized person for the duration of your time, whether it's a job or 4 years of school. And so there's this type of pressure that can just weigh on a person. And so a lot of my joy is when Bree, my main character, is with other Black women and she feels a release. And I feel like part of my work was building in the pressure such that the reader also experiences this like relief of her, her accent comes back a little bit. Her chest feels looser. She feels safer. Like, these are experiences that I've had where I didn't even know that I was holding tension and that I was on guard and vigilant, the whole day or a whole week. And then all of a sudden I was with people where I felt safe and my entire body loosened up. And so I think that was part of one of the things I wanted to depict. And that for there's a few years ago, there was a lot of talk about safe spaces and people would make fun of that. But like, the reality is it's more like relaxation spaces where marginalized people don't have to have their guard up, that they don't have to have armor on all the time and ears open, and like just how draining that is. The depression actually just drains your energy. And so I really wanted to help show that, and that it's not that relief from that brings joy, it's just joy grows so much more in those spaces, and joy happens more freely when you don't have to worry about that. And so, you know, part of what I wanted to do is have her be able to find pockets of that in the other space, and who are the people that in your life that are allies that can give you some of that similar feeling. So I'm hopeful that I did that as well. But you know, there's an atmosphere of relief that I think is something that people may not always realize is happening for marginalized folks.
Thank you for that. I hate to jump in, but I think I think our 45 minutes are almost up. So I just want to end by asking if anybody has any last thoughts they want to, you know, just throw out there as, you know, oh my gosh, I need to tell you this about realism or fantasy, and or something we didn't get to touch on. So I want to give everybody the opportunity just in case before we wrap up. No, now everybody's like, got everything. Well, I do have to say, I think this has been an absolutely fascinating discussion. This gave me a lot to think about. I hope everybody watching found a lot to think about. It's so easy for us to think about, you know, separating fantasy and realism or things like that. And I think this conversation just showed that so many of those conversations and thought processes we have really overlap. And really, you know, show us that there's not actually as big a divide between those areas of literature as we think. Could everybody, I guess, before we go, just tell us drop their social media handles in the chat, or tell us them if you want to keep in touch so that people who are participating can continue the conversations afterwards. Sorry.
My Twitter is S_Raughley. Just as you see, I don't know if you can see on the screen, but yeah, S_Raughley. And it's same for my Instagram. Yes, exactly that. Same for my Instagram, and my website is sarahraughley.com.
Thank you. Tracy?
I am Tracy Deonn, just my name, everywhere. That's my website, that's my Instagram and my Twitter. So TracyDeonn.
Great. Rachel?
I am at Lynn, RLYNN_Solomon on Twitter and Instagram, and RachelSolomonBooks.com.
Thank you. Jennifer, do you have social medias you want to share?
Yeah, it's just Jen Sommersby or JenniferSommersby.com, and then you can find the rest of the socials from there.
Great. Nafiza? Oh, you're on mute.
I am at Nafiza, Nafizaa, and Instagram is Nafiza, Nazaz, Nafizaaz.
Thank you. Rebecca?
I'm Rebecca Sky on Twitter and the Rebecca Sky on TikTok and Instagram, and RebeccaSky.com is my website.
Great. Tash? You dropped yours, I think, in the chat.
Yeah, I'm Tash Mcadam everywhere. My website's also just Tash Mcadam.
Okay. And Sabina?
I'm Sabina Writer, Sabina_writer on Insta and Twitter, and then Sabina Khan-writer on Sabina-Khan.com is my website.
Okay. And if for some reason you want to follow me, I'm R_Bittner on Twitter. And I don't really do much on Instagram, so that's not going to happen. And my website is docrob.ca. Okay, so I think that's about it. If you're watching, give a huge round of applause from wherever you are for this wonderful, wonderful panel. And I'm not sure if INFUSION-YA people have anything else to say before we log off.
We do. Thank you so much. Sorry, from Janet Eastwood. She just really wanted to say this is a wonderful panel. Thank you, everyone. We 100% agree. Thank you, everyone who joined us today, whether it was one panel or every single one. If you did every single one, you're a trooper. And thank you to all of the authors and guests for joining us today. There's quite a few, actually, who again joined us for multiple panels, and you're all troopers. And I hope everyone has a great, very well-deserved nap after this. Enjoy the rest of Saturday. I hope it's sunny where you are. If it's not, I hope it comes out soon for a nice sunset at least. Take care, stay safe. We'll be in touch soon, everyone. Bye.
Bye. Thank you all so much.